Okay, everybody, this is Seth Sinclair. Good afternoon, or maybe good morning, depending on where you are. I am the president and COO of Plan for Healthcare. Again, thank you all for taking the time to join today. I'm coming to you guys from Northern Virginia, where we are getting pummeled by a pretty good snowstorm outside, and so I've been a little bit nervously watching the weather, and hopefully I don't lose power right in the middle of this webinar. If we do, I think I have a backup plan, but so let's hope that goes smoothly. And I'm here today to talk about this idea of business planning and business planning best practices and how they can specifically benefit VA medical centers. These are planning best practices that really would benefit any organization, but for today, the focus will be on VA medical centers, and we'll take a detailed look at how this model can unfold inside a VA hospital organization. So for the webinar today, we will start by talking about the general planning challenge that every medical center faces to some degree. And then I'm going to link that into how business planning helps address that planning challenge. We're going to talk about what does a business planning process look like? How is it organized? What are the outcomes? What do you need? Are there downsides? What are the challenges that go along with trying to run a model like this? And what are the key success factors? I'll summarize. We'll do questions. We'll end promptly in an hour. I can promise you guys that. We'll stop at 1 p.m. Eastern. And if you do have questions through the session, you can use the GoToWebinar functionality to submit those. I may not be able to get to them right away, but I will at the very least do my best to try to attend to those by the end. I will be recording this webinar, and for folks who have registered, we generally will send them back out. And so you can share it if you've got anyone else in your organization that might want to see this. And then we also do post these, or I can share a link with you guys where all of our webinars are posted online. So just a quick personal introduction, who I am. Again, Seth Sinclair. I have been working for many years in the area of management consulting, leadership development, and strategic and project planning. I actually grew up with a father who worked in VA. He retired as a senior executive back in 2003, which is a long time ago, but that was, made a big impression on me in terms of understanding VA and valuing it as an organization. And just professionally, I've personally had the privilege of working with a very wide range of VA organizations. That goes back over 12 years. I've worked with everyone from certainly VA hospitals in the field to central program offices, VBA, CFM. So I've really touched on many parts of the organization. The methods and best practices that we're going to talk about today they come from work that I started doing out in the field with VA medical centers as far back as 2011. And that was work that was being done with teams of very experienced subject matter experts, folks who spent long careers in the organization, who worked their way progressively up from staff levels all the way up to the highest levels of senior administration, both in terms of management, administration, and finance. And so having the opportunity with those types of people with that expertise to look at what works and put that together, that's really the foundation that we've built on and that we'd like to talk to you about today. Okay. So why does it matter? Why are we even talking about this, or why would anybody have any interest in this idea of business planning? Well, it goes back to a planning challenge that every VA medical center to some degree face every year. I completely recognize that all medical centers are unique in some way. I've had the opportunity to work with some of the largest in the system, in urban settings to some of the smallest in very rural settings. And so I've seen the wide range of organizational characteristics that are in the VA system. But that being said, they are all going to face a similar set of decisions and constraints. First, every medical center has got to figure out their local priorities. And leadership is tasked with asserting those specific goals, objectives, and initiatives that they wish to accomplish at that local level. So we know, again, systematically, VA has some system-wide goals and priorities. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But at the local level, there needs to be clarity on what the organization is trying to accomplish for at least 1, 2, 3 years into the future. Then the next thing that needs to be understood is what are the operational needs and resources that are required to achieve those priorities. So we're talking about things like staff and other things that are cost money, fund control points, dollars associated with those contracts, whatever they might be, facilities. So you've got this operational component where there has to be a clear picture of what does it take to operate the organization in accordance with the priorities that leadership is trying to execute. And then, of course, there's a third major component to this challenge, which is figuring out how do we get all this stuff done within our budget, with what we can afford. There obviously is a limit. Every medical center is going to get a budget, and there's only so much in terms of their resources that they're going to be able to use. So the question that's posed to leaders at every medical center is, how do I align this organization? How do I line up my operations in order to achieve the priorities that are important here in a way that is financially responsible? And that's a process that needs to happen every fiscal year. Okay, again, not easy, certainly may be variable. Some sites, as we know, may be in a very tight financial position. Some maybe have more resources. Either way, the challenge of trying to figure out how to best apply those to align to priorities and operations is always going to be the question that must be addressed. Now, there are other things that make this difficult. There are other, attributes of these organizations and challenges that we've observed over the years that we know make it hard to do a good job tackling this planning challenge. Certainly one is that there is no standardized process across the system for performing this facility level type of planning that we're going to talk about today. There's not a consistent tool set. For some sites, they do almost nothing with this type of planning. Others have homegrown tools, if you will, but there's not a consistent set. There's varying philosophies from site to site in the way to approach planning, so you end up with different approaches. And this is a major one. I really do empathize with the leadership teams at many of the medical centers who they might want to take on this type of planning, but because they are often consumed with the fire of the day, if you will, whatever it might be, whether it's sales scores that are really putting pressure on leadership. There might be media attention. There's other mandates and things that are pushed down that must be handled with urgency. So leadership really struggles often to be proactive, to get ahead of the game and to be able to look forward with their planning. It doesn't help when you have leadership turnover, which we know there can be quite a bit. And so if a medical center director, an associate director, chief of staff, certainly the fiscal leadership, the HR leadership, if these positions are turning over on a regular basis, it makes it very difficult for that organization to be able to get a grip on this planning challenge. Okay, we know priorities are changing, administration change, the focus of the organization changes, some of the models, requirements that are pushed down again are changing. Right now everyone's trying to figure out what is the implication going to be of the Mission Act and the new standards, which is just another very, very timely example of, what does this mean from a planning perspective? Sites have different levels of business acumen. Some have the data, some have the expertise, if you will, to plan effectively, and some don't. And then just historically speaking, a lot of VA hospitals do tend to operate in a siloed manner, meaning the services don't necessarily talk to each other through the planning process. And so it makes it difficult to really achieve good integration, if you will, from a planning perspective. And then, of course, as I mentioned, every site's got their unique considerations, maybe their geography, what are the things they do there, what are the services they offer, what is the demand going forward. And so how do all of those things come together within a planning framework, right? So all these things make it hard, but that's why we've got a model here calling business planning as a way to help tackle that. It's not the only way, but for the purpose of this call, we're going to talk about it as a very, very effective way, or can be a very effective way to take on this planning challenge. So let's jump in and take a closer look. So of course, I've got to start with the definition, and we'll start with a very simple saying: a business plan is something that defines a framework for operational and financial success. So again, going back to this planning challenge, That framework is going to need to incorporate priorities, operational needs, and factor in the financial parameters. So a business planning process is one through systematically those all come together. It's going to be informed again by goals and priorities, very significant service level input, and then everything is being balanced and weighed against the financial constraints. Okay. And just a word of caution, I think semantics become challenging when we talk about this. I do recognize that when we mention strategic planning, tactical planning, operational planning, budgeting, and then now I'm throwing in business planning. And so folks will say, I don't really understand the difference. What do these things really mean? Are they really distinct from each other? Are they truly the same thing? And I don't want to get too caught up in that. Obviously, I'm going to try to differentiate and focus on business planning. But one thing that does help is for any organization that's going to adopt this type of framework, it is very beneficial to establish a common language and understanding so we can be clear about how those different elements of planning all do work together and how they are different and from each other. So just keep that in mind, and I will speak to that more as we move through the presentation. Okay, so what I'd like to do here is give you guys really the highest level view of how business planning works. And again, the foundation for business planning should be the facility's priorities, right? Of course, they're also being influenced by broader organizational priorities, but that is the foundation from which business planning proceeds. Okay. From there, then we have this, jumped ahead, hold on one second. We have this bottom-up type of input. There's a very strong bottom-up component to business planning. And so every service in the medical center puts together a comprehensive business plan for the coming year. So of course, as we move forward, I'm going to talk about the details of what goes into those. Now, once those plans are developed, everything comes forward for management review. Leadership is going to look across everything, and they're going to evaluate all of these plans in the context of priorities and resource constraints, right? So they're going to have to do some math. They're going to have to look at their budget allocation. They're going to look at that allocation, and they're going to dig into it to figure out what really do they have discretion on and what is sort of fixed. And from that, they're going to be able to assess what can we afford? What does this budget permit us to support? And then from there, through continued review, dialogue, feedback, and we'll talk about the process in more detail, is when all of that will come together. All of this input from the service level through this management review is pushed together to form one integrated facility business plan. And then from there, that then results in a feedback loop to the services to help them finalize their individual service plans. Okay, so that's the big picture of business planning. That's how the dots are connected. And this is, again, something that would be repeated on an annual basis. When this is done, if you get through this process, it puts the organization in position to move into the next fiscal year with this framework for success in place. All right, so for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about what's happening in some of these areas, and then we'll get into the considerations at the local level for what does it take to get this done. I did mention, again, I wanted to try to show where this concept of business planning fits into a broader planning hierarchy, right? So here you see sort of a classic planning structure. You've got mission at the highest levels. Mission then begets strategy. Strategy is trying to answer the question at the highest levels of, well, how are we going to accomplish this mission? Of course, we know the mission in VHA is very clear. And so then that is then translated into broader strategies. That's where, there's influence at the administration level, certainly, and at the VACO level, they're going to be tailoring that. Usually those are 5-year time horizon. That's then further decomposed down into more specific goals. And then as that then is pushed down into the network level, they become progressively more detailed. And then that's decomposed all the way down to the medical center level, and it begins to show up in the form of detailed objectives, priorities, goals. And again, don't let the semantics confuse us too much, but bottom line is, as you get to the medical center level, they become more clear. You answer the question of how are we going to fulfill these goals here in this organization and what is important to us locally. And then that needs to translate down into operating plans and budgets. And so that's really where business planning fits. Business planning fits at the level, at the medical center level, and it is the process through which the organization can translate the goals that have been handed down and those priorities that have been developed at the local level into an operating plan. That's how business planning relates to the other aspects of this broader planning hierarchy. All right. So let me, this is just a really high level look at characterizing business planning and comparing it against, I'd say, sort of a more traditional, I'll use the term old school planning philosophy that we've observed. And when I say old school, I really do mean old school. I don't think there's still a lot of medical centers that truly run the way that I'm characterizing in this traditional planning, although I've seen examples that are pretty similar to this. In an old school kind of approach to planning, most of the planning is done in a very centralized top-down fashion. So it's leadership and fiscal that really are the primary decision makers. They are primarily using prior year foundation from which to look at the needs or plan for the coming year. Okay, so this is sort of the whole, at the most simple level, this is the idea of taking a budget or a plan from the prior year and doing the old copy to this year and plus it up a little bit. Okay, and it can work, but what becomes difficult is when organizational priorities shift. That model doesn't really, it's not very agile. It's difficult to then shift the overall operational and budget aspect of planning to align back to the priorities. So it tends to be a bit more reactive. And in that model, the staff is not very engaged. At the service level, your service chiefs, planning is more dictated to them. Resources and expectations for accomplishments are pushed down and services are expected to proceed as tasked. Okay. Now, I'm not necessarily going to say that this doesn't work or is inherently bad. There are organizations that manage very tightly in this way and can be successful. Now, on the other side, if you implement a full business planning approach like we're talking about here today, it is much more decentralized. It does have that very strong bottom-up component where services are feeding the planning process, if you will. There's a lot of communication and feedback, a lot of dialogue throughout this process, both upward to management and downward, if you will, back to the services. And then I would even say horizontally, if you think about it that way, across services. And everything is very need-based. All the planning is tied back to priorities. And therefore, as they change from year to year, there is the ability to shift priorities and to shift resources towards the greatest area of need. If you systematically implement it, if you run a model like this and you do it in preparation for each fiscal year, it is very proactive and it establishes a foundation that leadership can use to react to in the year if things do change. Okay, but proactive for developing a foundation and then gives you the ability to react as needed because you already have a solid plan in place. And then this model is very highly engaged in terms of service chiefs being a part of it, contributing, but owning their plans as well and becoming managers of their resources, once we get through the planning process. Now, what I see, so when I go out into the field and, working with sites on putting models like this in place, what I most typically see is a little bit of a hybrid probably between these two, these two philosophies here. In most cases, what I'll see is sort of I'll call it a budget call model where services are a part of planning. They are asked for input into planning for the coming year, but it's often limited to resource only. And even within resources, sometimes it'll really be focused on fund control points or overtime, for example. And the gap that I'll see is the services aren't being asked to really build a comprehensive plan where they have their detailed objectives and priorities and action plans, okay? And so that's a little bit of foreshadowing when we talk about what goes into business planning, but that's the gap that I normally see. And again, now I have seen facilities who certainly are closer to implementing a full business planning concept. There may be some details that are tweaked. Timing is certainly something that can vary. The level of detail that they expect the services to go into in planning, the level of transparency and collaboration when it comes to decision making. Those are all things that might vary from site to site, but there are sites that are very close to taking that approach. All right, so I wanted to give you guys kind of take a step back before we drive down into detail and look at a business planning cycle from a holistic perspective and within the view of sort of an annual picture, okay? And if you're able to see, I understand it might be a little small depending on your computer and your screen. What you're gonna see here is this starts with this step number 1 up here in the, about your 1 o'clock, if you will, on the screen. And it all again begins with setting those fiscal year priorities, all right? And so in a perfect world, if I were to draw this up ideally, and this is based on my experience and what I've seen work well, that springtime, early year is a great time for that to happen, all right? And we've actually done a whole other webinar on strategic analysis and what does strategic planning look like. We've got 2 of those actually. So I'm not going to talk too much about what we would recommend would happen in order for those priorities to be developed. But I, again, would say that this is a great time of the year for that thinking to happen, and at least by April, May at the latest, for leadership to be able to come forward and say, hey, here's the 5 major things we're trying to accomplish this year. All right, very, very important that they are clearly communicated out to the organization. All right, now, I will say some organizations that even do employ this business planning type approach, they may attempt to do that without having those priorities asserted. It's not a deal breaker. It's still possible to have success because there are some enduring key drivers. I mean, right now, for example, we all know access, huge key driver. Patient experience, huge key driver. Every leader in VA just, what was it, just 2 weeks ago, all together talking about patient experience. So we know that that's a major key driver for the organization. Certainly quality, certainly employee engagement and satisfaction. Those are enduring key drivers that even if the facility has not clearly articulated unique priorities, those can still be used as the basis to inform a planning model like this, okay? Now, as you move forward, essentially what needs to happen, and everything in here is oriented to having this business planning done before the next fiscal year begins. That's really what everything in here is all about, okay? So in that May timeframe to get organized, to be able to get a business planning cycle kicked off, if you will, that's over here on the right, number 2 is, and then to get everybody working on it, get everything set up, configured, scheduled, get your service chiefs involved, get them kicked off working on their plans. And then what you want to do is give your services some time. So it's very appropriate to give them several weeks, maybe even a couple months, 8 weeks to go through that process. They're very busy, so we want to be respectful of that. And at the same time, we want to give them sort of a framework and deadlines to work in so we can help them get through the process, right? Once that happens, and again, late July, early August would be optimal, the services can finalize their plans, submit them, and then we go through a briefing process. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but essentially in a really well-run business planning cycle, there are very comprehensive briefings given to leadership on those plans, right? It's all part of the dialogue that is needed in order for this model to really work. A lot of feedback given there, okay? Then as we move down here right around the 6 o'clock, we have our 7th step, and that's where leadership's got to really kick into decision-making mode. This is where financial parameters are defined, and this is where leadership looks across all of these plans and begins to make their decisions. They are asking the question based on everything that was proposed from the service perspective. Then how do I actually, what can I actually support? What do I approve? What do I support? And how does that translate back into plans that would then be handed back to the services? Okay, so all of that needs to be communicated and everything then can be finalized. So there's going to basically be 2 outputs from these. Okay, there's going to be a facility level aggregated plan and then individual approved service level plans. And if you do this right, you can have it all locked up by 9/30, and as you cross over into the new fiscal year on 10/1, you are good to go. You've got a very, very solid planning foundation. It's very integrated across the organization, and you're able to move into the year with a framework in place. Okay, then from there, certainly you're transitioning into what we would call execution mode. That's where you're actually going out and doing the work that has been defined in the plans. On timing, just a word, I will say it's not always realistic to organize it this way. There may be a bunch of different variables that make it hard to follow this type of calendar. At the same time, some sites actually, leadership may prefer to rotate this forward, clockwise, if you will, in terms of the steps. Why would you do that? Well, for some sites, the belief is that you don't know enough about your budget in the August timeframe and even September to make all the decisions you'd like to make to finalize this business planning. And I would just say that I totally understand that. We've seen sites be very successful actually initiating business planning more in September, October, and then wrapping things up in November. So they essentially use Q1 as sort of the planning framework, and then they really execute for the remaining 3 quarters in the year. That can work very well. I would just say that I think when an organization matures to get really good at business planning, they do have the ability to make good budget decisions and assumptions even before everything is known to them with their budget. And then once you get into the year, if more information about the budget becomes available or as it becomes available, you have a framework in place to go back and then adjust the plans that were developed. Okay, so some sites very conservative with their financial planning estimates, so maybe they're very tight in terms of the resources that they deem to be affordable. They allocate accordingly, and then let's say there's a revised MCAS or a final that comes out in December, January, whatever it might be. Well, let's say there's more resources available. It's not difficult to go back in and then add those back into the organization, because you've already got this really detailed framework that you can work from to go back and do that type of analysis. All right. So again, this isn't the only way to do it, but this is certainly a view of a best practice that we recommend when we are involved in helping with this. All right. So what I'd like to do is ask you guys to put on your hat of being a service chief. Okay. So we've talked at a macro level about how business planning works, but what I'd like to do is give you guys a more detailed view of this service level experience. And again, this strong bottom-up component, which is heavily driven by the services. So what is it that we're asking the services to do? What we're saying to them is, all right, we want you to put together a fully complete plan, and it needs to touch on a lot of stuff, not just resources. And we want you to really systematically look at yourself and think about sort of, who you are, what do, where do you want to go, and then where do the resources come into that? Okay, so let's take a detailed look at what we're asking them to really plan around, right? So these are just some of the elements. These are most of the elements, and there may be others, but that we are asking those services to work on in developing a plan. So again, the questions, we're challenging them to ask. Who are you? What is your scope and mission? How are you performing currently? Are you doing well? Where are you struggling? What are the opportunities that you'd like to take advantage of? And what are some of the threats that you might need to be wary of or planning against to prevent things from happening in the coming year, prevent negative outcomes? What does your workload look like? Where do you think that's going? Okay. And then what is it that you propose to prioritize at the service level? And then, of course, how does that drive what the facility is trying to accomplish? And then it makes sense with all of that analysis and foundation done. Then it makes sense to start thinking about resources. So the question becomes, if I were to be able to accomplish these objectives that I'm asserting, if I were to meet the workload, if I were to take advantage of opportunities, then what are the resources I would need to operate effectively in the coming year? All right. So again, we're not breaking apart resources. They are part of the planning equation for the service. Now, I'm going to just very briefly touch on some of the elements because we could do a whole session on this. Some of these are tricky, but I did at least want to speak to them because the reality is if your organization is considering putting a framework like this in place, you've got to come up with a way to figure out how to do this, okay? So I think anybody on here who works with data or who maybe works in a service, administrative officer, whatever it might be, we can probably all agree that looking at workload can be a challenge, all right? So that depends on the service. That depends on the data quality, that depends on the input, certainly, of data. Data capture, if you will, workload capture. There's a lot of variables, but one thing I will tell you is when you put a business planning process in place, it can help with a lot of those challenges because the services become very incented to take a close look at their workload if they haven't already. What we're going for, without trying to here in this session tackle all of the challenges about how do you really quantify workload, how do you measure it, how do you compare it, what we're looking for is for the service to put together a sound estimate. Okay, we want a credible estimate of where it looks like workload is going for the coming year. All right, why? Again, now you got to put your hat back on and be a leadership team, and all these services are going to come in and present a business plan to you, and they're going to have resource requests. So the service chief's goal is to help leadership get a clear picture of what it looks like the workload trajectory is. All right, now perfection is not the goal here. All right, and there are some basic guidelines and data points out there. Historical data certainly is useful, all right, to show trends over the prior periods. And then there's always the opportunity to go look at some of the overall facility projection data. Every facility, there are demand projections. There are projections on workload by at least by, if it's not down to the type of service level, it's by type of service provided. And so we would expect to see some correlation with those projections, okay? And those projections actually do a pretty good job of taking a lot of variables into account to include very specific market, unique demand in that market. And, now throw in something like the Mission Act and, certainly raises questions on where that's going to go. But bottom line is we need the service to think about workload, to be thoughtful about it, not perfect, but to give us a decent picture of the trajectory. Ultimately, if I'm a director or the leadership team reviewing these, I'd like to know the total % change in workload and have an understanding of how that then ties back to resources, okay? So then let's talk about these tactical objectives that we're asking the service to build, okay? So I would recommend that every service is building at least 5, if not a couple more, very well-formed, very smart objectives. Time focus is for the upcoming fiscal year. Some certainly can span multiple years, but the typical focus is going to be a 1-year focus. Every objective that a service writes there should be a linkage back to one of those facility priorities or at least a key driver. All right. And so, sometimes a service might look at this and say, hey, I'm really just going to do what I have been doing all along. And the answer is there are still some objectives. There are still outcome-based objectives that should be framing the way that you do operate. Okay. And so for a service to be able to define a SMART objective and then further decompose them down into a mini action plan, if you will, that's the best practice that we're shooting for. Now, for those of you guys that are maybe thinking about your organization, you're thinking about your service chiefs, I will say, their ability to do a good job of this does depend on their experience in planning and their business acumen. Sometimes there is a learning curve to get them to be able to, put together a good tactical objective framework. I can give you plenty of examples of some that have been very poorly constructed. A tactical objective, a bad tactical objective, if you will, would say, bring on 2 more FTE, okay? We see those, that's okay. We certainly want to work on that. A good tactical objective would be more, improve access by 4% in a specific location or clinic and achieve that by, Q2 2020. And then from there, breaking that down into, what needs to be done. Is there need to be some kind of an assessment to look at gaps? Is there a study that needs to be done? Is there some space configuration that needs to be implemented? And then, certainly from there, how do you know at the end whether or not you've met your goals or not? All that can be broken down and should be built in to every single service's business plan, okay? So it takes a little work, but I'll tell you, once you can turn the corner and get your services to build well-aligned, well-defined tactical objectives, it is a game changer for all the rest of the planning elements that flow from there. So in this business planning framework, planning for resources is of course crucial, and within resources, FTE is the biggest chunk. For most medical centers, FTE are going to be about 65% of total resources. So being able to effectively plan for staffing is a major success factor. And so what we ask the services to do in a business planning framework is to take a close look at their turnover, to think about the losses, to think about all the backfills that need to be happening, okay? To think about approved positions that haven't been filled yet, and to look at, then what are new proposed positions that they are putting on the table in the context of the business plan. So you need to lead them. There needs to be a process through which they go through this progression of thinking, and they are able to document a staffing plan that reflects all of these inputs. And then really it should be reconciled with the services org chart ultimately. We can talk more about that. But asking services to do this, yes, they are having to look into a crystal ball a little bit, if you will. Again, if you're doing this in June, July, if you were to do it this June, July, looking to 2020, certainly they're not going to know everything, but no one is in a better position than a service chief to make this type of planning projection, right? So we need them to provide this type of input. Certainly benchmarking can be a part of this analysis. You can look at like facilities if they are structured accordingly. There's some data out there by cost center. It's an imperfect way of comparing site to site, but there are ways to do benchmarking to help that service chief be grounded in how they're putting this plan together. Even another aspect that can be extremely beneficial depending on how the facility ultimately does budgets and tracking is to look at the time dimension of when these things are going to happen. And that can help us build a cumulative look of the total FTE need by service for the coming year, and then of course can be rolled up and looked at from the facility perspective. Okay, just a quick note on the other resource request areas. When it comes to contracts, fund control points, overtime, fee providers, I didn't put that on here. What we want the services to do is look at their historical data, validate it. Again, there is data cleanup to be done, certainly with the FTE as well, right? We all know T&Ls can get lost. Fund control points, who owns them? Contracts, where are they assigned? Are they being tracked and managed? Is overtime being correctly recorded back to the service based on how the services are organized? All of those are things that in the first year of a business planning process, or taking a close look at this, sometimes we surface issues. Okay, so part of this is validating a historical baseline. What do we have here before? What does my service have? And is it correct? Do we need to do any cleanup? And then you're going to make projections for these for the coming year. And I'll make that argument again that they need to be connected back to tactical objectives and correlate clearly with workload and staffing. Okay. I have seen services come in and sit in front of the leadership team, and they'll bring in, an overtime request, for example, and it shows a significant increase from the past year. At the same time, the workload projection doesn't show much change, and there were also requests for additional FTE. Okay. Now, is that, typical that a service would come in and do that? Maybe not, and it may not necessarily be wrong, but we do have to empathize with the leadership teams who are trying to make tough decisions, who are trying to look at their total financial constraints. And if you were sitting in that chair, you would likely push back and ask the question, how come you need overtime if you also have made these other projections? All right, so we are putting the service in a position to need to put together an integrated plan where the dots are connected. Taking it a step further, when the service is sitting down to go through this exercise, it is a great time for them to think about all the other things they need for the year: education, travel, furniture, space considerations, equipment. What a great time for them to look at all of those things, do a needs assessment, think about the requirements, and input them into the business plan. So again, in a lot of facilities, what we see is these elements sort of live in their own tracks. And that's okay, but what I would suggest is building them into business planning means they're all together holistically in one place, and then they can be reviewed in a way that makes sense. Again, everything is connecting the dots within this business plan. And then everything in these individual areas can then be rolled up. And when it comes to decision-making, budget decision-making, all of these pieces can be looked at holistically and then plugged in And then in turn, again, all of this ultimately results back in agreements that are given to the services. All right, so again, I highly recommend that those are part of this model and not left outside of it. Now, once services have gone to the effort to put together a very good business plan, then it's only fair that leadership would give them an opportunity to come in and brief it, and that there would be dialogue. Okay, so that's a best practice. And so in that best practice, and facilities do it different ways. Some will really cram it into a whole week. The leadership team basically goes into a room. You need a good space to do this, by the way, where the services can come in. Sometimes the services will bring their staff, and they'll present. They'll run through their plan. There will be a feedback loop. Another best practice you're not seeing on here, by the way, is for the leadership member who's responsible for that service to take a look at the plan before it comes into the management briefing. That saves a lot of time and can really hone in the presentation that's given to the leadership team. We heavily recommend full ELT participation as a best practice. Okay, and I know that's a challenge, but I have seen examples where a service comes in and the ELT is only partially there, and that can really frustrate the service who went to the trouble to put a good plan together, and then it hampers decision making later if you're having to revisit everything, because folks weren't in the room at key points and during key discussions. So I would just recommend that the structure is set up. If it needs to be spread out over multiple weeks and scheduled, that's fine. Very crucial that services are given detailed feedback so that they can go back and, if needed, make adjustments to their plans before they're finalized. And then just keep in mind that if a leadership team sits through these briefings, and I would even recommend that fiscal, HR, maybe your VERA coordinator, potentially facilities engineering, it may make sense for them to all have representatives in the room, because they are going to hear things from these business plans that are going to be very relevant to them and what they're trying to accomplish for the year. And so when that happens at the end of this process, leadership is in a fantastic position to take a holistic look at the needs that are being set forth from the operational level. Okay, so I'm going to take a few more minutes to wrap this up, and then I'm actually going to breeze through an example of a service business plan. But let me talk about how it all comes together here at the end. All right, so I'm using the term roll up. Roll up in my language here is the process through which all of the needs are looked at together, evaluated, and decision making is made. So leadership and fiscal, they decide what they can afford. They go through that process. Then they actually allocate budgets to the services. All right, and so again, minimally, that's going to be FTE overtime fund control points. Then that's passed back to the service in the form of an agreement. It's all documented. Leadership can put special instructions in there so there's clarity on what's being approved. Okay, the services then can acknowledge or sign those agreements. How that's handled is different site by site. And then you move into this execution and monitoring phase. With those types of service level agreements in place and facility level total plan in place, everything you need to monitor your execution, both in terms of accomplishing tactical objectives, but also looking at resources, all those pieces are there. So looking at and having a governance process through which you looked at planned versus actual, and to be able to see where it looks like services may be either under or overusing or projected to under or overuse. All of that is available now. We've done all the work to create that, all right? And then that facilitates decision making. And truly, and even though I know sometimes, some facilities or services would almost, think of this as impossible, if you use this model to its full effectiveness, if you're partially through the year and you've got services who, for whatever reason, are not able to utilize their resources, they can be reallocated to other areas of need. That is actually realistic, and we've seen it happen. And yes, some services may be defensive, but remember, business planning is redone every year. So if a baseline needs to be reset, it can be. The last thing I want to see is for a medical center to go into the year and have resources that it didn't make full advantage of and that weren't put to the highest areas of need. And then, of course, the other side of the coin is the other thing you don't want to see is a medical center who doesn't have a grip on this and ends up in a very poor financial position. And at the end of the year is, projecting a significant deficit, which we all know is something that is not sustainable. Okay. So benefits. So again, when you run a business planning model, leadership really gets a great view of the needs. Everything is very systematic and integrated. Lots of dialogue, lots of feedback from leadership to services. You know, I didn't really talk about it, but if you think about it, business planning can drive tremendous efficiencies by being able to look across the organization and seeing the needs of the different services, and again, starting to connect those dots with a more horizontal integration, if you will. This can actually drive huge financial results for an organization if this model is put in place. It really helps prioritize resources. It can be very transparent. This is something services really appreciate. They know that they may not get what they want at the service level, but at least it's transparent. At least everybody understands how it works. Services become more attuned to the idea that the total financial, the constraints of the facility, limit what can be done. And it gives them more insight to that, which is extremely powerful. Okay, having service level agreements is just a best practice. You know, it's expectations, it's clarity. And I mentioned before, business planning is quite decentralized. So we're empowering our service chiefs to run their service. When they've got a business plan, they're given, approval to run with those tactical objectives. They've got their resources. They should be able to run, and they shouldn't have to be coming back constantly. As long as they're in their budget, they shouldn't have to be constantly coming back to resource committee to ask for resources. Okay, and that there in turn encourages them to develop their business plan and ownership. And then when it comes to execution throughout the year, it really is an enhanced level of communication. So in order for this to work, key success factors, things that kind of have to be in place in order for this to be successful. Leadership's got to want to do it. That seems obvious, but leadership has got to be plugged into this. At the least, they are advocating and leading the decision-making process. You need someone to run the process. You need an owner of business planning. AD is a good champion usually. Sometimes someone, the CFO or some combination of the two, someone from leadership office. Really, the whole organization has to be clear on how this works. They have to agree on the principles. There's got to be the data cleaned up and available. Okay, expectations to services have got to be made clear. Fiscal, HR, other admin functions must be a part of this. They're all in there. Minimally, they are informing the process, but optimally, again, they're all part of the decision making. Services are involved. You close it out. You go through the model. You actually make your decisions, push it forward, and then we need good integration. What you don't want to do is do this and then get stuck running sort of a parallel management process or a parallel legacy process. That's confusing, and you guys don't have the time to do that. So the governance structures really need to come into place. So if you were thinking about putting this model in place in your medical center for 2020, just keep in mind, and there's a lot of things on here that are very similar to what I had on the last slide, just keep in mind that you're going to need a champion. You've got to have all the administrative support. You've got to have the horses, if you will, to put planning and scheduling all these events together, right? To communicate with the chiefs, to set up the briefings. You got to get the data in there. You've got to train your service chiefs. You've got to teach them how to do a business plan. And they need a tool to develop a business plan. And you need something that allows you to build the plans, and then something that allows you to aggregate the plans and do the decision making. You need a communication plan for every aspect of business planning. You got to get the governance structure in place, and then certainly you've got to have that framework in place for monitoring. Okay. Now, very quickly, before I'm going to breeze through an example of a plan, I should mention, putting a business plan model in place does come with some challenges and risks. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Now, as you've guessed, my position is, putting this in place is well worth overcoming these challenges and managing these risks. And there's just a few here, but it is time consuming, certainly compared to nothing. It may feel like it's a lot of work to put business planning in place. I believe the payback is there many times over, and that the time will ultimately be saved, leadership's time, service chief's time, because there's clarity, because there has been good communication. So it's going to prevent a lot of issues downstream. But when you're in the middle of doing this, especially in the first year, it is time consuming. Okay. The distraction factor. I understand. We've seen this. I just sat with the director the other day. She was telling me how difficult it is right now, constantly being called out of the office. Again, lots of focus on sale, travel. I mean, just all these things, okay? It's manageable, but we have to keep in mind that that can make it very difficult to execute. Data issues, like we've already talked about. The challenge of needing to be able to support service chiefs so that they know what they're doing, all right? That is, how do you train them? The challenge is that, and the risk is if you don't, they will not buy in. And if service chiefs fall off, if they don't see if they're not given clarity on what's expected of them, if they're not supported and helped along the way, and if they don't understand what's in it for them, they will not buy in. I mentioned before, sort of a partial implementation can lead to duplication, which then results in frustration. So for example, if you put business planning in, but then it doesn't really connect with your RMC process, it just, that now it's confusing. And so people have a hard time linking decisions that are made to business planning to decision making later, all right? And then our observation, of course, again, is because there's sort of a lack of standard method and tool set out there, it's hard. If you're starting from scratch and you don't have that resource available to you, it can be very, very difficult to get off the ground, okay? All right, breezing through an example, and when I say quick, I mean quick. This is just a viewpoint of a service that has put together a business plan. It's going to be hard for you guys to see. What you're seeing here is it being done in the tool set that we've developed for this, and it was just the best example that I had to show you guys today. Again, I did not come on here to make a sales pitch. I just wanted to talk about business planning being a best practice for VA. And this is just a look at one of them. So this is a service who's gone through and done a qualitative analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Everything is nicely documented in here, connected back to key drivers. This is a view of a service doing some workload projections, historical baseline, the units customized to the service, and making a projection for the coming period and being able to look at total % change and some justification around that. Here's a view in the context of a business plan of a service doing what we call a make-buy analysis. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with that, but for them to look at opportunities where maybe there's more advantageous ways, in-house, out-of-house, purchase, lease, whatever it might be, that is very valuable in a business plan. We've seen services who have built multiple of these as part of their business planning, total business planning approach. Building those tactical objectives, detailing those out, building in, you can kind of see down here, this has been further broken into, action items. Being able to roll these up, look at them systematically, obviously very key, but again, just an example of a service who's gone ahead and put those together for a fiscal year. Requests for the other resources, making, pulling in historical data for contracts, fund control points, making the request for the coming year, typing in justification and an explanation, rolling it up to look at the total request. This is just a view of a service going in and starting to build a staffing plan down here at the bottom, and a sort of a graphical representation of the cost, if you will, of that staffing plan illustrated above. They're putting in those positions, they're thinking about those losses and gains and proposed and the time dimension, and building them in helps us draw the big picture. Equipment. So, I know most facilities are either have implemented or in the process of implementing SEP-G. And so, you don't need to duplicate that in business planning, but like I said before, I would recommend that that discussion happens as a part of business planning. So pulling those in and discussing those types of requests during business planning briefings is something that just makes perfect sense, okay? I mentioned that, a facility is going to go through the process of calculating what they can afford. So having a template that's, standardized for that, looking at all revenue, looking at expenses, looking at things like average salary to be able to determine what can be affordable, having all that done. And some sites are very comfortable communicating the results of that analysis out to the services, again, increasing their perspective and buy-in. And then here's just a view of if you put your leadership hat back on and think about them going service by service and actually beginning to plug in resource approvals, if you will, along with additional instructions. This is just a view of how one way to do it. Of course, there's other ways to do it. And ultimately, that all coming together to kick out service agreements that can be reviewed, agreed to, signed, and tracked, okay? And then when all that's in place, like I said, you've got a wonderful foundation in place to transition to monitoring. And that's where you can really begin to look at the comparison of actual to budget and projected to budget, and engage in decision making at the service level. Your chiefs can keep an eye on this, and the facility can keep an eye on this. And this is the basis for resource management for the rest of the year moving forward. Okay, so in summary, I agree with you guys. This is something that would benefit VHA as a whole, the consistent approach. Certainly an integrated model is something that drives alignment and decision making. It drives savings. It does require leadership support and processes and tools, and it does take a couple years to get it right 100%. Okay. However, even in that first year, the turnarounds that we have seen are amazing in just 1 year. Even for an organization that did not have good historical planning discipline and maybe does not have business acumen in place, it's year 2, year 3 where really things start clicking and they all come together. I will mention one thing. This is a planning model that really works well for any facility, not just ones that are poor performers, not just ones that need a financial turnaround. Again, even if you're a high performer and doing well, the future is always going to have some degree of uncertainty, and also we know that resources may change, and so you need to have a framework, no matter how well you're doing now, to be able to handle those variables in the future. So again, thank you all. Our contact information is here. I think most folks on do know that we do have best practices and a tool set that facilitates this. So if you would like to learn more about that, please do contact me. My information is here. Otherwise, I just want to thank you guys all for being on today, for taking the time, and I will hang on here if anybody did in fact have any questions. I didn't see any submitted through the chat, but I will hang on in case anybody does, and I will provide a copy of the webinar back to all of you. So thank you again. Appreciate your time. Hope you guys are all warmer and a little less snow than we have here, and we'll look forward to talking to you all again in the future.